Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to the other side of history. Now, we left off in our last talk with England being plagued with the sweating sickness. King Henry, he changed his residence again and remained alone, keeping himself apart except doing confession every day. Henry wrote again to Anne Boleyn and sent her his physician. He said in his letter, "The most displeasing news that could occur came to me suddenly at night. On 3 accounts I must lament it. One, to hear of the illness of my mistress, whom I esteem more than all the world, and whose health I desire as I do my own. I would willingly bear half of what you suffer to cure you. The second, from the fear that I shall have to endure my wearisome absence much longer, which has hitherto given me all the vexation that was possible. And when gloomy thoughts fill my mind, then I pray God to remove far from me such troublesome and rebellious idea. The third, because my physician, in whom I have most confidence, is absent. Yet, from the want of him, I send you my second, and hope that he will soon make you well. I shall then love him more than ever. I beseech you to be guided by his advice in your illness. By your doing this, I hope soon to see you again, which will be to me a greater comfort than all the precious jewels in the world." The pestilence broke out with even more violence around Henry, and he kept fleeing from one place to another. Henry gave his counsel to Cardinal Wolsey, and he said, "As soon as anyone falls ill in the place where you are, fly to another, and go thus from place to place." End quote. Wolsey was even more alarmed than Henry. As soon as he felt the slightest perspiration, he fancied himself to be a dead man. Writing to the king, Wolsey said, "I entreat your highness to show yourself full of pity for my soul. These are perhaps the last words I shall address to you. The whole world will see by my last testament that you have not bestowed your favor upon an ungrateful man." End quote. So Henry, he responded to Wolsey, "Put apart fear and fantasies, and wear a cheerful humor in the midst of death." End quote. At last, the sickness, it began to diminish, and immediately the desire to see Anne, it revived in Henry's heart. Anne reappeared at court, and all of the king's thoughts were then bent on the divorce. If the church annulled the king's first marriage, Anne, seeing the principal object removed, thought she might accept Henry's hand. She wrote to Wolsey, "I long to hear from you news of the legate, for I do hope they shall be very good." End quote. Henry added in a postscript, "The not hearing of the legate's arrival in France causeth us somewhat to muse. Notwithstanding we trust by your diligence and vigilance, with the assistance of Almighty God, shortly to be eased out of that trouble." End quote. But still there was no news of the ambassador. Was he lost in the Alps or at sea? Did his gout detain him in some village? Or was the announcement of his departure even true? While waiting for the long-desired ambassador, everyone at the English court played their part as well as they could. Anne, whether from conscience, prudence, or modesty, refused the honors which the king would have showered upon her, and never approached Catherine but with marks of profound respect. Wolsey gave the appearance of desiring a divorce, while in reality he dreaded it. Wolsey saw the divorce as the cause of his ruin and that of popedom. Henry tried to conceal the motives which caused him to separate from the queen. To the bishops, he spoke of his conscience. To the nobility, of an heir. And to the rest, of his sad obligation which compelled him to put away so justly beloved a princess. Henry, in the meanwhile, seemed to live on the best terms with Catherine. Catherine lived with the king as during their happiest days, and treated Anne with kindness. She adopted an elegant costume, encouraged music and dancing in her apartments, often appeared in public, and seemed desirous of captivating by her gracious smiles the goodwill of England. This was really a mournful comedy that was destined to end in tragedy, full of tears and agony. Anne was not without her enemies, even in her own family. Anne's sister-in-law, she was a proud and passionate woman and a Roman Catholic. She had sworn a hatred against her young sister Anne. In this way, wounds would be able to be inflicted, even in the domestic sanctuary, which would not be less deep because they were the work of her own kindred. One day, Anne found in her chamber a book of pretended prophecies, in which was a picture representing a king, a queen shedding tears, and at their feet a young lady that was headless. Anne turned away her eyes in disgust. She did want to know, however, what it was supposed to mean. There was a pretended wise man, who are so numerous in all times, who abused the gullibility of the ignorant by professing to interpret such mysteries. This prophetic picture, he said, represents the history of the king and his wife. Anne understood what her enemies meant to insinuate, and dismissed the interpreter without betraying any signs of fear. She turned to her favorite attendant and said, "Look at this book of prophecies. This is the king, this is the queen, wringing her hands and mourning, and this, putting her finger on the bleeding body, is myself, with my head cut off." End quote. The young attendant answered with a shudder, "If I thought it were true, I would not myself have him, were he an emperor." End quote. Anne responded with a sweet smile, "I think the book a babble, and am resolved to have him, that my issue may be royal, whatever may become of me." End quote. Anne did have several relapses. The trials which she foresaw, and the grief that Catherine must necessarily feel, had agitated and disturbed her mind. But when she saw what seemed to be the church and even her own enemies prepared to pronounce the king's divorce, her doubts were removed, and she regarded it as legitimate, the position that was offered to her. The king suffered from Anne's scruples, but was delighted when he saw acceptance from her. Catherine was visited by 2 cardinals, and they told her that she might prevent the blow which threatened her by voluntarily retirement into a convent. They censured Catherine, and they said, "How is it, Madame? Explain the mystery to us. From the moment the Holy Father appointed us to examine the question of your divorce, you have been sent not only at court, but in public, wearing the most magnificent ornaments, participating with an appearance of gaiety and satisfaction at amusements and festivities which you have never tolerated before. The church is in the most cruel embarrassment with regard to you. The king, your husband, is in the greatest perplexity. The princess, your daughter, is taken from you, and instead of shedding tears, you give yourself up to vanity. Renounce the world, Madame. Enter a nunnery. Our Holy Father himself requires this of you." End quote. Catherine responded, Alas, my lords, is it now a question whether I am the king's lawful wife or not, when I have been married to him almost 20 years and no objection raised before? There are prelates and lords yet alive who adjudged our marriage good and lawful, and now to say it is detestable? This is a great marvel to me, especially when I consider what a wise prince the king's father was, and also the natural love and affection my father, King Ferdinand, bare unto me. I think that neither of these illustrious princes would have made me contract an illicit union. If I weep, my lords, it is not for myself. It is for a person dearer to me than my life. What? I should consent to an act which deprives my daughter of a crown? No, I will not sacrifice my child. I know what dangers threaten me. I am only a weak woman, a stranger, without learning, advisers, or friends. My enemies are skillful, learned in the laws, and desirous to merit their master's favor. More than that, even my judges are my enemies. Can I receive as such a man exhorted from the Pope by manifest lying? And you, she turned to Cardinal Wolsey, having failed in attaining the tiara, you have sworn to revenge yourself on my nephew, the Emperor. You have kept him true promise, for of all his wars and vexations he may only thank you. One victim was not enough for you. Forging abominable suppositions, you desire to plunge his aunt into a frightful abyss. But my cause is just, and I trust it in the Lord's hand. End of quote. Catherine then withdrew to her apartments. She laid aside her brilliant ornaments, assumed the sober garments in which she was usually represented, and passed the days and nights in mourning and in tears. The cardinal's hopes were deceived. They had thought to find a nun, and had met a queen and a mother. Catherine would not renounce Henry. The cardinals had been sent by the Pope to annul Henry's marriage. The Vatican letters show how it was this act of the Pope that made Anne Boleyn resolved to accept Henry's hand in marriage. This is an important detail that we are indebted to the Vatican letters. Now, Aubigne, the source that we are taking our talk from, he says, we should be grateful to the papacy for having so carefully preserved them. End quote. However, seeing that Catherine would not renounce Henry, the church knew that they must try and prevail upon Henry to renounce his idea of separating from Catherine. Henry was furious. "Is this how the Pope keeps his word?" he exclaimed. "He sends me an ambassador to annul my marriage, but in reality to confirm it." End of quote. It was a dilemma. There was even brought up the idea of permitting the king to have 2 wives, as we see in the Old Testament. Both Henry and Catherine were equally persuaded of the justice of their cause. "I see that you have chosen your part," said Henry to the papal ambassador. "Mine, you may be sure, will soon be taken also. Let the Pope only persevere in this way of acting, and the apostolic see, covered with perpetual infamy, will be visited with a frightful destruction." End of quote. This lion had thrown off the lamb's skin, which he had momentarily assumed. The ambassador felt that he must appease Henry. craft, and delay were his orders from Rome. The Holy Father ardently desires that this matter should be terminated by a happy reconciliation between you and the Queen. But if that is impossible, you shall judge yourself whether or not His Holiness can keep his promises." End quote. So he then read the bull. This exhibition produced the desired effect, and Henry grew calm and said, "Now I am at ease again. This miraculous talisman revives all my courage. His decretal is the efficacious remedy that will restore peace to my oppressed conscience and joy to my bruised heart. Write to His Holiness that this immense benefit binds me to him so closely that he may expect from me more than his imagination can conceive." End quote. The ambassador, having shown the bull, hastened to lock it up again. He knew that Henry and Cardinal Wolsey would leave no means untried to get possession of it. Then victory would be theirs. Wolsey asked the ambassador for the decretal, with an air of candor as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He desired, he said, to show it to the king's privy councillors. The ambassador said that the Pope had granted this bull not to be used but to be kept secret. He simply desired to show the king the good feeling by which he was animated. End quote. Henry then tried his skill. "Have the goodness to hand me the bull which you showed me," he said. The ambassador respectively refused, and Henry, he stifled his anger. "For a single moment," said Henry, but he still refused to let it go. It became evident that the Pope, in granting the bull, had been only acting a part, and this trick, it revolted King Henry. It was no longer just anger that he felt, but disgust. Wolsey knew that Henry's contempt was more to be feared than his wrath. So there is much more on this history, but we are going to have to get into that in future talks. I hope you have enjoyed this talk. If you have, I would encourage you to click on that subscribe button, leave your comments. I want to thank each one of you for listening, and I'm wishing God's blessings.